Welcome to the Real News Network. We're in Cambridge at MIT with Professor Noam Chomsky, who I think needs no introduction. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
So a few days ago, the Obama administration and Geithner, they announced their plan for the banks. What do you make of it?
Well, there's several plans, actually. One is recapitalization. The other's, the more recent one, is picking up the toxic assets with a private-public coalition. And that sent the stock market zooming right away. And you can see why. It's extremely good for bankers and investors. It means that an investor can, if they want, purchase these valueless assets. And if they happen to go up, he makes money. If they go down, government insures it. So there might be a slight loss, but there could be a big gain. And that's one financial manager put it in the Financial Times this morning. It's a win-win situation. So
win-win situation if you're the investor.
If you're the investor,
if you're the investor, it's
for the public, it's a lose-lose situation. But the entire frame, I mean, they're simply recycling pretty much the Bush-Paulson measures, and, changing them a little. But essentially the same idea. Keep the institutional structure the same, try to kind of patch things up, bribe the banks and investors to help out, but avoid the measures that might get to the heart of the problem, and however at the cost, if you consider it a cost, of changing the institutional structure.
What's the plan you would support?
Right. Well, I would say, for example, take the bonuses, the AIG bonuses that are causing such anger, rightfully. Dean Baker pointed out that there's an easy way to deal with it. Just since the government pretty much owns AIG anyway, it just doesn't use its power to make decisions. Split off the section of AIG, the financial investment section that caused all the problems, split it off and let it go bankrupt. And then the executives can seek to get their bonuses from a bankrupt firm if they like. So that would pretty much take care of the bankruptcy problem, and the government would still maintain its large-scale effective control, if it wants to exert it, of what's viable in AIG. And with the banks, the big banks like Bank of America, one of the big problems is nobody knows what's going on inside. Very opaque devices and manipulations, which technically the government, they're not going to tell you themselves. Why should they? It's not their business. In fact, when Associated Press sent journalists to interview bank managers, investment firm managers, and asked them what they'd done with the TARP money, they just laughed. They said, it's none of your business. We're private enterprises. Your task, the public, is to fund us, but not to know what we're doing. But the government could find out, namely, essentially, take over the banks.
Is all of this sort of machinations of policy because they want to avoid nationalization?
You don't have to use the word nationalization if it bothers people, but some form of receivership, which would at least allow independent investigators, government investigators, to get into the books, find out what they're doing, who owes what to whom, which is the basis for any form of modification. I mean, you could go on to something much beyond, but it's not contemplated. It's not a law of nature that corporations have to be dedicated solely to profit for their shareholders. That's it's not even legislation. It's mostly court decisions and management rules and so on. And it's perfectly conceivable for corporations, if they exist, to be responsible to stakeholders, to the community, to the workforce.
Well, especially when it's all public money that's running this. At this point, it's running the system.
Look, the fact of the matter is, it's almost always public money. So take, say, the richest man in the world, Bill Gates. How did he become the richest man in the world? Well, a lot of it is public money. In fact, places like where we're sitting right now.
MIT.
That's where computers were developed, the internet was developed, fancy software was developed, either here or in similar places, and almost entirely on public funding. The way, and then of course the way the system works fundamentally, this is kind of like an overstatement, but fundamentally is that the public pays the costs and takes the risks, and the profit is privatized.
Which is what we're seeing now with the whole
Well, now
banking bailout.
there's a lot of talk about it now because it's the financial institutions and it's very visible. But it happens all the time. I mean, as I say, computers and the internet, the basis for the IT revolution of the late 90s.
So when you say challenging the institutional structure, what would you like to see happen?
For a start, corporations, banks, and so on should be, I think, responsible to stakeholders. That's not a huge change. In fact, it's even been brought to the courts. There was an important case, highly relevant now, about 30 years ago when the major steel companies wanted to destroy the Youngstown steel plants. That's the major part of the steel industry, the core of the community. The community had been built up around it and so on. And they wanted to move it or get rid of it. And the workers and the community wanted to keep it and felt they could run it privately. And in fact, they brought a case up through the courts arguing that the management rules ought to be changed so that stakeholders, rather than just shareholders, should have control over the corporation. Well, it lost in the courts, naturally, but it's a perfectly feasible idea. It would be a way to keep communities alive and industry here.
So if you're looking at the financial system now, and you take this principle of being representing the interest of all stakeholders, not just shareholders, what would that look like in terms of policy?
It would mean that, first of all, it would begin with, it would mean that the government would not just bail out the banks, pour capital into them, but would exercise control. And control begins with inspection, so we find out what they're doing. And then you keep the viable parts, and if they're viable, they might just as well be under public control. I mean, the government could have probably bought AIG or Citigroup for far less than what they're paying them out. Public means, in a democratic society, the government would mean the public, and then there should be direct public engagement in what these institutions ought to do and how they ought to distribute their money, what the terms ought to be, and so on. They could be democratically run by the workforce, by the community.
But doesn't it, whether you use the word or not, it requires a kind of nationalization? I mean, does the bank then become a publicly owned institution?
They become publicly owned institutions, which serve the public and where decisions are made by the public. Now, that's a long way off. You have to approach that in steps. When we think of nationalization, the doctrinal system, with historical reasons, associates nationalization with some big brother taking it over and public follows orders. But that's not necessarily the way it's done. There are many nationalized institutions that are run quite efficiently. In fact, take say Chile, which is supposed to be the poster child for Thatcherite, Reaganite, free market economics. A large part of the economy is based on a nationalized, very efficient copper producer, Codelco, which was nationalized by Allende, but was so effective that during the Pinochet years it was never dismantled. Actually, it's being sort of chipped away at now. But it still provides I think it's still the biggest copper producer in the world, provides most of the government income. And elsewhere, too, they're highly successful nationalized firms, but nationalization is only one step towards democratization. The question is who manages them, who makes the decisions, who controls them. Now, in the case of nationalized institutions, it's still top-down, but it doesn't have to be. It's not a law of nature that institutions can't be democratically run.
What would it look like?
What would they look like? It would be participation by workers' councils, by community organizations, meetings, discussions in which policies are made. That's how a democracy is supposed to work. We're very far from that, even in the political system. Just take, say, primaries. Okay, the way our system works, if a candidate's running for office, his campaign managers go to some town in New Hampshire and they set up a meeting, and the candidate comes in and says, "Here's what a nice guy I am, vote for me." People either believe them or not and go home. Well, suppose we had a democratic system. It would work the other way around. The people in the town of New Hampshire would get together and at conferences, meetings, public organizations, and so on, and they would work out the policies that they would like to see. And then if somebody's running for office, they can invite, he could come if they want. They could invite him, and they would listen. He would listen to them. They would say, look, here's the policies we want you to implement. If you can do this, we'll allow you to represent us, but we'll recall you if you're not doing it.
Well, as you say, this is far off in terms of
It's not that
today's
far
politics.
off. It happens. I mean,
But at the national level, it's...
the national level, it's far off. But let's take what's probably the most democratic country in the Western Hemisphere, although people don't like to think of it that way, Bolivia. It's the poorest country in the hemisphere, outside of, worse in South America. It's had elections in the last couple of years in which the large majority of the population, who happen to be the most repressed people in the hemisphere, the indigenous population, have for the first time in 500 years entered the political arena, determined the policies they want, and elected a leader from their own ranks, poor peasant. And the issues are very serious. They're control over resources, economic justice, cultural rights, the complexities of a highly varied, diverse, multi-ethnic society. But the policies are pretty much coming out of the public themselves, and the president is supposed to implement them. Now, nothing works that perfectly, all sorts of problems, but that's kind of the basic theme. Okay, that's functioning democracy. It's almost the opposite of the way our system works.
Well, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about the future of democracy, or what we might call it in the United States. Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Professor Noam Chomsky.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington, there's a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through a myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea, why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said, in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the real news.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.